Occupying Till He Comes at Southwest Prophecy Ministries.
Welcome, friends. This is Dane Rome, your announcer for today's Last Days Beacon program. Thanks for listening. Thanks for joining us. Just a reminder that these programs are supported by your gifts to this ministry. If you'd like to contribute to this ongoing faith ministry, which deals with biblical prophecy and current events, simply go to our website to contribute. Our website address is www.swpm.us, and you'll find a donate link on the homepage. The website address again is www.swpm.us. Thanks for your prayers and support for this faith ministry. On today's program, Dr. Dave Schnitker will be interviewing Carol Rustin regarding her brand new article, The Battle for Jerusalem. Hardly a day goes by without a major news story about the battle for Jerusalem, whether it's violence on the Temple Mount, a terror attack, or demonstrations against security measures. Something is always boiling over in the city of Jerusalem. How do we begin to understand the origins and depth of this conflict, and where is it heading? That's what this program will deal with. Let's join Dr. Schnitker and Carol Rustin for today's fascinating discussion.
Thank you, Dane. It is a great privilege to have Carol Rustin on the program both today and next week to discuss her brand new article, The Battle for Jerusalem. This is actually a two-part article, which is the Last Days Beacon article for August and September. If you are not a subscriber to the Last Days Beacon or would like copies of this particular article, our announcer will share how to do that at the end of today's program. Well, friends, I've had the privilege of knowing and working with Carol for many years. We won't say how many years at a previous ministry. I also had the privilege of working with Carol's father, the late Noah Hutchings. Noah graduated to glory a couple years ago after an amazingly productive life in which he wrote over 100 books and perhaps did as many as 10,000 radio broadcasts. He also visited the land of Israel, I think something like 55 times, a very productive and long life. Carol was very much a part of Noah's ministry, and she is an accomplished author as well. In fact, she co-authored a book with her father. I think it was called The Christian Cleansing of America, just a few years ago, and perhaps co-wrote other books that I'm not aware of. But she has written many articles through the years and is a veteran of radio ministry also. And for those of you who have followed our ministry, Carol has been of great help in launching Southwest Prophecy Ministry about 2 years ago, and I'm thrilled to have her writing and broadcasting for us once again. Well, Carol, welcome to our program today.
Well, thank you so much for having me, David. It's great to be here.
Well, it's good to have you back. And I recently asked Carol to write us an article on the battle for Jerusalem, and there was so much to share. She actually wrote two articles, and we'll be talking about the first article today, which will be our August Last Days Beacon program article. We have a copy of that right here, and it's called The Battle for Jerusalem, Part 1. September, of course, will be Part 2. Well, Carol is not only writing about a subject of which she has great interest, but she has also firsthand experience living in the city of Jerusalem. Carol, tell us about your years living in Jerusalem and some of the insights and perspective you gained from that experience.
Well, do we have about 3 years?
How about 3 minutes?
Okay, I'll try to compress it down into 3 minutes. Actually, I had visited Israel twice before I actually went to live there, and I found that living in a country is much different than touring a country or visiting a country. You really get to know the people, you get to know the country, you learn so much. And it's not just learning a language, which I did learn, but you really learn about the people and the country. In many ways, it was a very eye-opening experience. And it's so different in Israel as well. Israel is smack in the middle of the Middle East. They are surrounded by hostile countries who want to kill every Jew and eliminate the state of Israel. So no matter what's going on in the country, there is this underlying tension that never goes away. I used to be very critical of Jewish families who would get themselves into debt because they would go on vacations. Well, after living there for a number of years, I understood why. You have to have a break. The political turmoil, the conflicts that are going on between the parties, the military threats, the terrorism that can go on in the country, it never goes away. Even to this day, Israel is still on military time because they're still on a war footing, and they have to be in order to survive as a country. They're under threats from Lebanon, Syria. Even the peace agreements with Jordan and Egypt are really not peace agreements according to Israelis. I was very stunned when I first started living there to find out that Israelis look at the peace with Egypt as, well, it's not war, but it's not peace either. It's a cold peace because Israelis will fill up planes going to visit Egypt and the pyramids, and they'll have business dealings in Egypt with Egypt, but those same planes will bring Israelis, tourists, and business people back to Israel. They're not filled with Egyptians or Arabs coming to visit Israel because Egyptians and Arabs and Muslims in Egypt and other countries refuse to come to Israel, even though Egypt has a peace agreement, supposedly, with Israel. So there's always an underlying tension there that never goes away. There's a saying in Israel that 24 hours in Israeli politics can be a long time. And that's absolutely true. You think of things that can happen here in the United States very quickly, but things can dramatically change, not only in Israeli politics, but just in the country in general, within a very short 24-hour period. The government, they have a Knesset, which is their legislative body, but whichever major party, whether it's the Likud or Labor that win, they form the government, and they kind of always have to have political parties join their coalition. And if some of the political parties threaten to pull out, well, then the government falls. They have new elections, and so there's always this constant tension underlying the feeling that's going on in the country. It never completely goes away, and especially since the Oslo Accords and their dramatic failure, they've not been a success, and they really opened the door for more terrorism in Israel. It's really been a very dramatic situation that never completely goes away and is never solved.
One of the things that I know you wanted to accomplish in writing these articles is to give people somewhat of a background of Jerusalem, and with a view toward helping people to understand the current tensions. So let's kind of rewind the clock of history, so to speak, a long way, because Jerusalem is an ancient city, of course, but not every one of our listeners might know some of the details of that. Who was it that established Jerusalem as the capital of Israel? And tell us about the temple that was built subsequent to that event.
Okay. Well, actually, David was the one who decided to make Jerusalem his capital. When he started reigning, he first reigned from Hebron, and for the first, I think, 7 years of his reign, and then he kicked out the Jebusites from Jerusalem, which actually they were supposed to do under Joshua, but they never did. And the Jebusites, they never really completely left Jerusalem. Well, David decided that that's where he wanted his capital to be. And that's where he had his city of David. And he also wanted to bring the tabernacle to Jerusalem, because he felt that that was going to be the center of the country. It's very interesting that in Hebrew, everything revolves around Jerusalem. When you say you're going to or from a city, it's fine unless it's Jerusalem. When you talk about Jerusalem, you're always going up to Jerusalem. You're never just going to Jerusalem, you're going up to Jerusalem. Whenever you're leaving Jerusalem, you're going down from Jerusalem. You're going down from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv. You're just not going from city to city. Jerusalem is the center of not only the country and the eternal city as far as Jews are concerned, it's really the center. Basically, I think God considers Jerusalem the center of the world. And so, and of course, I think it's the center of the Bible as well.
Right.
So it's very interesting the way that plays out in Hebrew. David established that city of David, and then when he bought the threshing floor, he decided to make that where the temple would be built. Now, that's usually, according to tradition, that's on Mount Moriah or Mount Moriah, where Abraham offered Isaac, or almost offered Isaac as a sacrifice. It's interesting that the Muslims substitute Ishmael. And that's where one of the conflicts comes in.
Right.
Because according to Islam, Abraham offered Ishmael, not Isaac.
And isn't the traditional site of Mount Moriah in the center of the Dome of the Rock?
That's where it's supposed to be. I've actually, I think on my first visit, I went inside the mosque, the Dome of the Rock, and you can actually go down and underneath it and see the actual, what they think is the stone and the rock where Abraham offered, as we know, Isaac.
Okay.
But the Arabs say is Ishmael.
Okay, so they have appropriated their own views to the sacredness of this place.
Yes, and that's what causes the conflict. Now, David, I think some biblical scholars say that he was born in about 907 BC. He reigned for about 70 years, and I guess he would have lived about between 70 and 75 years. But he reigned for about, he reigned for about 40 years, which means he started reigning when he was 30, so he lived for about 70 years, which would have, when Solomon took over, he built the temple. I think that would have brought the finishing of the temple about 825, 820 BC.
Okay.
So that's, I think that's why Jews really revere the city of Jerusalem, is because that's where the temple was. And it didn't last very long, as we think of lasting long. Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple in 586 BC. So to be honest with you, the temple really didn't last as long as we might think. When we read the Bible, we would think of the temple standing for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, but it really didn't last that long.
Right, somewhere around 250 years by my calculation.
Yeah.
And then, of course, in the providence of God, after that 70 years of captivity was over, there was the return of a remnant of Judah into Judah, and a second temple was built. Tell us about that second temple.
Well, I think that a lot of the Bible says that the Jews who returned from captivity and who had seen the first temple were very, very disappointed, because Solomon's temple, they had taken such care with it, and it was so magnificent that they were so disappointed that they cried, because they knew that the second temple was not going to be anywhere near the quality that Solomon's temple was. In fact, it's very, very interesting that Zechariah, when he wrote his book, of prophecy that we have in the Old Testament, he could not even get around the city on horseback. He had to get off his horse or whatever mount he was riding and lead the animal around because the stones were so scattered you couldn't even get through there. So him prophesying that one day Jerusalem would be a burdensome stone for all people is an actually amazing prophecy, considering what he saw at the time. He would never have imagined the conflicts that are going on now with Jerusalem, considering what he saw when he saw the city and,
Right.
and the destruction, and that it was still in very bad shape.
Right. And of course, one of the burdens of the book of Zechariah was the rebuilding of the second temple, known as Zerubbabel's temple, because he was the leader in that project. And again, as you say, compared to Solomon's temple, it was really very second rate. It was embellished some years later. You want to tell us about that, the refurbishing of that Zerubbabel's temple?
Yes. Herod, who was basically installed as a puppet king by the Roman government, that was one of his building projects. And he really worked hard to make it beyond compare. And he really I think he probably, part of it was that he wanted it to outshine Solomon's temple. So it was, I think all the time that he was actually ruling over the country by Rome, he spent most of his time embellishing and adding to the temple to make it a great temple. And he finished it not maybe a year or two before Titus invaded Israel and actually destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. So it's very sad that he spent all these years and all that money and it really came to naught.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, that Herod's temple, as we know it, was the temple in Jesus' day. This was the temple that when Jesus would come and overturn the money changers.
Right.
And toward the end of his ministry, he said to the Jews, he says, "Your house is left unto you desolate." What else did he prophesy regarding that temple, and how was that prophecy fulfilled?
Well, of course, then that brings us to the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, which is also spoken of in Luke. And the disciples came to Jesus and say, "Look how wonderful this temple is." And Jesus said, "I'm sorry, but this is not going to last. There's going to be a day coming not too far off when there will not be one stone left upon another." And of course, we know that came true in 70 AD. Actually, Titus, I think, probably from what I understand from history, he left the major operations to, his military people under him. It's very sad because when you read this account in Josephus, the city was in such desperate straits that people were starving because Titus had surrounded the city basically and was starving them out. And a lot of people resorted to cannibalism just to stay alive. It was very, very shocking. And then, of course, when Titus was able to take over the Temple Mount and go actually into the city, the Roman soldiers spared no one. It didn't matter if you were a man or a woman or a child. They killed everybody. And if you wanted to escape, you had to escape with your life. It's very interesting, though, that the Christians at that time, they heeded Jesus' warning. He says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, flee to the mountains. I think that's kind of a dual prophecy. It had its fulfillment in 70 AD, and I think we're going to see another fulfillment of that prophecy during the tribulation period. Because
that's a good point. Sometimes we only think of that as a future prophecy, but it did have a near-term fulfillment as well.
Yes, because the Christians read that, and when they saw what was going to go on, they fled, and they fled to the hills and left. And of course, they were able to survive. So Josephus, to be honest with you, is not well thought of by the Jews. They really consider him to be a traitor, but he did did a very good job of recording the account of Titus's invasion into the city and actually what was going on in the city right before the city fell. It's a tragic account. If people want to read about it, they can read about the account either here, they can read a fuller account in Josephus's writings as well. But it's a very, very tragic and sad thing. It was hard for me to read. It really was.
And of course, this was in fulfillment of prophecy, as Jesus warned the Jews that their rejection of their Messiah would result in a cataclysmic judgment. Now, the amazing thing, of course, that we could talk about for many, many broadcasts is the miraculous return of Jews to the land. I don't think there's any other country in history that has had this kind of thing, where the country is overrun and its populace dispersed for 2,000 years, and then for those folks, that ethnic group, to regather in that same location is a miracle of cosmic proportions. But before that happened, and of course there's a lot of history we could talk about in the intervening years, but there were some who had visited the Holy Land in the 19th century before the Jews began their prophesied return, and we have some record of that. What was Palestine, or what we call today Israel, like before the Jews began to return?
Well, actually, the Mamluks and then the Ottomans had taken over that area, and it was the Ottoman Empire that was taking care of that, or ruling over that area at that time. The Arabs had no interest. The Arabs and the Muslims had no interest in the land of Israel at all. And it had become a wasteland, a desert. It was desolate. People who visited there rarely saw anybody. Jerusalem wasn't very populated. The whole country wasn't very populated. David Roberts was a famous artist and painter who went over there and drew and painted many pictures of the Holy Land at that time. And you just get the feeling of, and I hate to say this again, but desolation, barrenness. There's really a bush or a tree. Mark Twain, when he wrote about the Holy Land in his Innocents Abroad book, and he noticed the same thing. He says, you go along and you never meet a soul. And when we think of the biblical history and the greatness of Israel and the Jews and the biblical accounts, and then you come here and you look at this land there are no trees, there are no gardens, there's no agriculture, there are no people, you don't see any animals. We've traveled all around, we barely meet a soul. So the Arabs and the Muslims had this land for hundreds of years, from about the 12th, 13th century on. And they proved to the world that they had no interest in this country. They didn't want to do anything with it. They could have cared less. So they had their opportunity to prove to the world that they really loved this land and they cared about it. They wanted to do something with it. They proved the exact opposite. And Mark Twain wasn't the only one. There were many other people who visited and made the same observations. You could also see this in David Roberts' paintings as well. It's a striking contrast to the Israel that we know today, which is a beautiful, beautiful country now.
Absolutely. Well, in the Old and the New Testament, we have prophecies concerning the regathering of Israel into the land. Jesus prophesied it. Old Testament prophets, they talked about it, and they talked about Jews coming from the east, the west, the north, and the south, both Old and New Testament, the exact order. And we could, again, devote an entire program to the exact fulfillment of that. In that same chronological order, Jews began to return from the east, then from the west, the north, and the south, over the last 110 years or so. So let's talk about significant events that occurred about 100 years ago, both in the Middle East and the Zionist movement, and also what was happening with the, how should we say, American theology that also complemented and supported what we call today the Zionist movement.
Mm-hmm. Well, about the 1880s, Jews around the world started becoming interested in going back to Israel, going back to the Holy Land, trying to go back to their national homeland, seeing if they could build a nation again, see if they could make something work. And there were a number of settlements established or tried to be established in Israel at that time, what we know as Israel today. A lot of them failed. They tried agriculture, and of course the land had been neglected for so long. It was hard to make anything grow. People would plant orange groves. People would plant trees, nut trees, and fruit trees, and do all types of agriculture. Most of those failed simply because the land was just in such poor shape. And so,
probably rocky soil, extremely dry and arid.
Yes, and I mean it hadn't been taken care of for years. And you have to have a certain amount of grass and vegetation and trees and water to be able to make something grow in a garden. I think and you have to have a certain amount of nourishments and nutrients in the soil to make things grow. And the land was very, very lacking. So it was very hard to make these settlements successful. And so a lot of the Jews that went over there left simply because they either ran out of money or they just couldn't make the settlements work. There were some that stuck it out. But it was very, very difficult. It's also interesting in the 1880s, around that time, that Christians started taking an interest in end times Bible prophecy. We have the rise of certain scholars that became interested in a premillennial, pre-tribulation rapture of the church point of view. And so this is what started in evangelical Christian circles, and it became very big. And of course, part of that theology and doctrine included the establishment or the reestablishment of the nation of Israel and the Jews returning to the land as part of end times Bible prophecy. So many scholars were probably mocked at that time because they didn't see this happening. But yet, I think we should be very grateful that those scholars stuck to their guns and based on Old Testament prophecies of the Jews returning to the land in Isaiah and Ezekiel, and the return of Israel and Jews as an people. It's, you made a very interesting comment earlier that you never had heard of an ethnic group keeping its identity. And there never has been one. Jews really did not assimilate into other countries, at least not very well. Of course, they were shunned by a lot of people and pushed into their own separate neighborhoods. But they had a very strong devotion to the laws of Moses, their traditions, keeping kosher, not eating pork, keeping their meat and milk dishes separated, going to synagogue, praying, the things that they were supposed to wear, the things that they were not supposed to wear, their keeping of the Sabbath, the Jewish Sabbath or Shabbat. All of these things separated Jews into their own communities naturally anyway, because they couldn't really have a lot of friendships or close relationships with Gentiles because they couldn't eat in their own, because Gentiles, of course, would never keep kosher. And I can testify that it's not something that you'd really normally want to do because there are lots of rules.
It's not easy for Gentiles to adopt the complexity of kosher living.
No. There are lots of things that you cannot eat, and then there are things that you cannot eat together. So it's not exactly an easy lifestyle. So that separates Jews anyway. I had a girlfriend in Israel, who told me that when she was growing up, her parents were very strict about keeping kosher and not having anything to do with other people. She and her sister actually got invited over to somebody's house for dinner. And the only way that their parents would allow them to go over and have dinner with them was that their mother accompanied them, and they could not eat the food that this family had to present to them. She had to be there, and she fed them from their own food that she had prepared. She went with the girls. She took their food and had their own plates and had to put their food in their plates to be able to sit with this family and with their other friends.
So that's strict kosher compliance.
Right. Very, very, very strict.
Right.
And so this is not something that allows Jews just right off the bat to have a lot of close personal relationships with non-Jews, Gentiles, even Gentile Christians anyway. So that pretty much separated them out. So them being able to keep that identity and their devotion to the laws of Moses, the Torah, and their biblical and historical traditions really helped enable them to stick together as a people, pretty much as a whole, so that when God opened the door for them to return, they were ready.
Absolutely. Well, on our next program, we're going to pick up from there as we actually begin to see the Aliyah, the return of Jews from around the world that God had preserved for these 2,000 years as a separate culture and religion. The events of the last 100 years really begin to get very interesting. So I think we've reached a good stopping point for today. Carol, thanks for joining me for today's program. And we will continue this discussion, friends, on next week's program as we consider how Israel became a nation, the current conflict, and what the Bible says about the outcome of the battle for Jerusalem. We've been talking with Carol Rushton about her brand new and very timely two-part article on the battle for Jerusalem. It's actually a two-part article. It's being published as our August and September edition of the Last Days Beacon. These articles will give you a panoramic history of the most significant city in the Bible and hence the most important city in the world, the city of Jerusalem, the city of peace. These articles will give you the background you need to understand the ongoing battle for Jerusalem and the Temple Mount and where this is all heading. I'm sure you will want to obtain these articles to share with family and friends. And now Dane Rome will share how you can obtain this article entitled The Battle for Jerusalem.
Thank you, Dr. Schnitker. Dear friends, every month, Southwest Prophecy Ministries produces an excellent article entitled The Last Days Beacon. These articles deal with a wide variety of subjects pertaining either to Bible prophecy or Christian liberty. For the first time, we're producing a two-part article that will be distributed in August and September. The two-part article is entitled The Battle for Jerusalem, and it deals with the past, present, and future of the conflict for the most important city in the world, the city of Jerusalem. We're offering a complimentary copy of this article to each one who requests it. Simply go to our website, www.swpm.us, and click on the Bookstore tab. Type Last Days Beacon in the Search tab, and then order your free copy of The Battle for Jerusalem. You may also order extra copies to share with friends and family. You may order 5 copies for $5, 25 copies for $15, or 100 copies for $60. When you order extra copies, you'll automatically be placed on our mailing list to receive the monthly mailing of the Last Days Beacon. Please join us next week for another Last Days Beacon program brought to you by Southwest Prophecy Ministries. And until then, this is Dane Rome, your announcer, saying thanks for listening.